is cessation of cardiac function. When there's a sudden cessation or stoppage of cardiac function, and the classical features that you see in a patient who has a cardiac arrest include these three things. First of all, the patient is usually unresponsive or unconscious. Secondly, there is an absence of palpable or detectable pulses. And third, which is about the list of them, is what we call agonal respiration or apnea. Apnea, we all know, is the brief cessation of breathing lasting greater than 10 seconds. So when we come across patients with these classical symptoms, signs, we say that the patient has suffered from a cardiac arrest. That leads us to the likely causes. Now, from the 2020 American Heart Association guidelines, there are what we call reversible causes of cardiac arrest. Now, these reversible causes have been termed in two different aspects, which is very easy for us to understand. We call them the 5H and the 5T. Now, what are the 5H? The 5H simply means 1, hypovolemia, 2, hypoxia, 3, hyperkalemia, 4, hypokalemia, and 5, hypothermia. Now, we all understand, but I'm glad that most of us here are medical practitioners here, that hypovolemia simply means a reduction in circulating blood volume. And we all know the relevance of blood when it comes to transport of oxygen. So what is the marked reduction in circulating blood volume? With time, it may lead to a patient having a cardiac arrest. Hypoxia is a reduction in oxygen at the tissue level. It has different types, from anemic, hypotoxic, hypoxic hypoxia. Then we now move to what we call the 5T. The 5T include thrombosis, cardiac tamponade, tension pneumothorax, as well as toxins. Now, when we have a scenario where either of these conditions play out, either when there's an elevation or a reduction in electrolytes or reduced circulating blood volume, it can actually lead to a cardiac arrest. Then the next we'll discuss briefly are the readings. What are the readings that you notice in the patient who has suffered a cardiac arrest? Now, the readings can be broadly divided into two. We have the shockable readings and the non-shockable readings. What that simply means is that the reading of the heart at that point for the cardiac arrest can either be amenable to a shock from a defibrillator or not. So if the reading is amenable to shock, it is called a shockable reading. And if it is not amenable, it is a non-shockable reading. And the shockable readings are basically two. We have the ventricular fibrillation as well as the pulseless ventricular tachycardia. Now those readings are readings that if we apply a defibrillator to such patients, the sinus reading can be gotten and the patient can actually benefit from the CPR, which we do for the injury for the patient. The non-shockable readings are the ones that go with very poor prognosis. What that simply means is that the chances of the patient coming out from an arrest which has a non-shockable reading, chances are very, very slim. And these readings are also two. One is the asystole, which is like a straight reading on a ECG, and the second one is called the pulseless electrical activity, otherwise called an electromechanical dissociation. What that simply means is that the patient will have absence of peripheral pulses, but on the ECG tracing, you can actually see some cardiac activity. That accounts for about 10% of cardiac arrest readings, and it only goes with the worst of prognosis. So that patients who have the pulseless electrical activity reading have reduced chances of survival post cardiac arrest. Then, our next point we briefly discussed is the basic life support. We hear about BLS all the time and ALS. BLS means basic life support, while ALS means basic life support. Simply means that it's the health care or the emergency care that is given by either a layman or a lay rescuer or a medical personnel to a patient or someone who has suffered cardiac arrest. Now, The essence of doing this is to increase the chances of survival for such patients who have survived and suffered the cardiac arrest. So the BLS can be done by medical personnel as well as a layman on the road, as long as they have been well tutored or taught the basic principles of basic life support. While ALS is the advanced life support. What that simply entails is that you make use of drugs this time around, monitored, as well as 100% oxygen being given to such patients. There are also other different equipment which may be employed in such management of patients who have a cardiac arrest. So the advanced life support, or ALS, is a more advanced form of the BLS, and it entails use of drugs, specific equipment, techniques, monitoring, and delivery of oxygen through 100% ventilation. Then we move to what we call the chain of survival. The chain of survival was actually initiated by the American Heart Association, and it has been reviewed over time. The last time it was reviewed was in the year 2020. And the chain of survival, which used to be 5, has now been increased to 6. And what does the chain of survival entail? There are a series of steps which, when taken by either a bystander, a load rescuer, or a medical personnel, can actually help to increase the chances of survival of a patient who has suffered a cardiac arrest. What is the chain of survival? The first thing, which is the most important, is what we call early recognition. Early recognition means you are able to recognize a patient who has suffered an arrest. Now, when you recognize the patient as suffered an arrest, what do you do next? The next thing you do is to activate the emergency services, which is imperative. That means specialized personnel will be called upon and call for help so as to ensure that most appropriate medical attention is given to such patients. Then the next step is called cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR. CPR is in the third chain of survival for patients and involves giving chest compression with rescue beds to such patients. Recent studies have shown that the chances of survival of a patient who suffered a cardiac arrest after prompt CPR has increased by almost 40 to 50%. That notwithstanding the effect of the defibrillator, which comes later. So after rapid CPR has commenced, the next thing is to get the defibrillator. Ideally, we should have an automated external defibrillator in specific areas within the hospital or even outside the hospital in an organized system, because the defibrillator has proven to be a wonderful invention with regard to management for patients who have pumped or who have suffered cardiac arrest. Then, post-cardiac arrest care. What care is given to a patient who has suffered cardiac arrest? Now, the post-cardiac arrest care entails some certain specifics which are usually important in ensuring that a patient who has been resuscitated has increased chances of survival. Now, the post-cardiac arrest care includes some aspects which include 1, oxygenation and ventilation of the patient. The patient is given adequate oxygen and well ventilated. 2, hemodynamic monitoring. You are monitoring the blood pressure, you are monitoring the mean arterial pressure, the mean output must be adequate, which usually ranges between 0.5 to 1 ml per kg per hour. You also talk about the mean arterial pressure, which is controlled pulse pressure plus the diastolic, which should not go anything less than 60 mm per mercury. Then you also look at the serum lactate as well as the CVP pressure, which should be within normal ranges. Then we move to what we call targeted temperature monitoring. What do we mean by targeted temperature monitoring? Because we also mentioned initially that hypothermia can cause cardiac arrest. Targeted temperature monitoring means we induce hypothermia with the aim of increasing the chances of survival of the patient. Studies also showed, even I think in 2015, that for every 1 degree reduction in the temperature, the core temperature of the patient, there's a reduction in the rate at which the brain utilizes oxygen. So there's what we call the cerebral metabolic rate of oxygen consumption, which is about 3.5 ml per 100 grams per minute. It is reduced in a patient, and as such, it can help in achieving what we call neuroprotection for that patient by preventing cerebral hypoxia. So that is also part of the chain of survival. Then, of course, neuro monitoring as well is also important for such patients, sedation and prognosis. The last aspect of the chain of survival is recovery. So after the CPR has been done, the defibrillation has been done, post-traumatic arrested, the recovery of patients is the last and the most significant part. We want to ensure that adequate steps are taken to ensure that there is full recovery for such patients. Then we would like to briefly discuss the reasons for early CPR. Why is the CPR important for a patient who has suffered cardiac arrest? The first thing is this: the chances of survival is triple. Rapid cardiopulmonary resuscitation has actually tripled the chances of survival of such patients. So early recognition and rapid CPR can actually lead to an increase in the chances of survival for patients who have suffered the cardiac arrest. Two, 2020 AHA guidelines talked about the importance of defibrillation for patients. The defibrillator is an electrical device. I have one here. What it actually does is that it sends electrical current through the chest to the myocardium. It depolarizes the myocardial cells simultaneously, thereby inhibiting what we call ventricular fibrillation, which is the kind of tachyarrhythmia that occurs mostly in patients who have cardiac arrest. So when you rapidly defibrillate a patient and you commence early CPR, there are increased chances of the patient surviving. Okay? So I also want to quickly discuss what we call special cases. So quickly, before we go on to watch the video, I want us to understand that there are also some scenarios which we consider as special cases for people who may be around or are caregivers for patients who may have suffered cardiac arrest. First one is for a pregnant patient. A pregnant woman may suffer a cardiac arrest. There are myriad reasons or causes for cardiac arrest during pregnancy. CPR is also advised for such patients. However, there are some little differences from the conventional CPR that is done. One, the major challenge for a pregnant woman is hypoxia. And the reason for this is that the gravity uterus itself causes a splinting of the diaphragm, and that leads to a reduction in functional cerebral capacity. And we all know that pregnancy is a hyperdynamic condition. So that means there's increased consumption of oxygen. So for a pregnant woman, hypoxia is the main concern. So adequate ventilation for such a patient is important. Secondly, while doing the CPR, there's something we call a comfort bench. For the effect of the gravity uterus on the aorta and inferior vena cava leads to a reduction in venous return. That invariably can cause reduction in cardiac output and subsequent hypertension. So while doing a CPR for a pregnant woman, it is advised that it is done under the comfort bench to achieve what we call a left lateral tilt, to displace the gravity uterus from impinging on the inferior vena cava as well as the aorta. Then, within 4 to 5 minutes, if there is no return of spontaneous cardiac activity, the perimotent cesarean section is advised to increase the chances of survival for both the mother and the child. Secondly, for opioid toxicity, well, with the abuse of drugs these days, it has been found that because of the sedative effect of opioids, patients will actually suffer cardiac arrest. So most times, if we have an emergency tray, there's a particular drug we use which is called naloxone. It should be an invaluable drug that should be in the tray for patients, for the caregiver. So if, for instance, an opioid toxicity is suspected, after initial pulmonary resuscitation, intravenous naloxone at a dose of about 0.4 to 2 milligrams can be given to such patients. Then, 3, a choking child. You all have kids at home here, for all the parents here, and sometimes you may not really know what your children deal with. They may get involved and get maybe granite or things, battery and all that. We come across different scenarios in the emergency room when they rush patients who have foreign objects in the airway. So how do you attend to such patients? Because such patients are prone to respiratory failure and subsequent cardiac arrest. In the subsequent video which I'll play, I will explain to us how we manage a choking child who has a foreign body in the airway. There's something we call the Heimlich maneuver, which is an abdominal thrust from the front, about 5, then 5 back straps. Then invaluable drugs that are important in management of cardiac arrest. One is magnesium. Magnesium, hypomagnesemia, is a condition which has been noticed to trigger what we call to service the point is actually a ventricular tachyarrhythmia. So it is important also that magnesium can also be given to patients. When such patients have a cardiac arrest and they've been connected to a monitor, and the ECG tracings are suggestive of a twisted endpoint, what we call prolonged QT syndrome. To study the point is suspected and magnesium can be given for such. Amiodarone, wonderful drug, also very, very important, but it's only indicated for what we call refractory cardiac arrest. What that means that if a patient has a ventricular fibrillation, which accounts for about 50% of most cardiac arrests or being that have been known, if after 3 shocks and the patient doesn't recover from the shock, and intravenous amiodarone is also advised for the patient. And then for the pediatric patients here, there's something for the pediatricians here. There's something we call is the mnemonic that we use. The mnemonic actually means wet flag. Wet flag is stands for different things that can be helpful in achieving resuscitation for the patient. The W stands for the weight, which can be gotten by some formulas 2n+8. The E is the energy, because for children they can actually be shocked to achieve what we call the sinus rhythm. Now the dosage for the energy being used to shock for pediatrics is about 2 joules to 4 joules per kg. So when a patient comes in with a shockable rhythm, it is advised that we can actually use the energy dosage of between 2 joules to 4 joules per kg. The T is the difficult tube because we're also concerned about airway protection for the patient. So the formula there is about N/4+4, where N is the age of the patient. Fluid. If we are considering hypovolemia or shock, the dosage is 20 ml per kg. A is for adrenaline. Adrenaline dosage is 0.01 mg per kg. While if after a glucose check and we see that the patient is hypoglycemic, the dosage should be between 2 to 4 mg per kg. So this is a mannequin that I've brought here just to make us understand basically what has been done, what we've discussed. There is something we call Dr. CARB-D. It's the mnemonic which we use for a patient who has suddenly suffered the cardiac arrest. And I will take us through that briefly. The D simply means danger or scene safety. Scene safety means to ensure that the scene is safe, not just for you, the medical person, but also for the patient. Anything at all that you feel may cause harm to the patient or you must be looked at and cleared. Afterwards, we go to what we call response. Response simply means that we tap on the patient's shoulder. Mister, can you hear me? You ask. You're waiting for the patient to respond. When the patient doesn't respond, you now go next to the ear, to the nose, and feel for breathing. This should be done within 10 seconds. And then it is subdivided into what we call look, listen, and feel. You are looking at the chest movement to ensure that the patient is making any breathing whatsoever, which is you do. You listen for any movement in the chest, then you feel for breathing. If there is nothing whatsoever, probably because the patient is not breathing and has suffered the cardiac arrest, you immediately call for help. When you call for help, you request for an AED and you call for help. So that is the top. Next thing, compression. Cardiac compression. We should never miss that. First thing is that cardiac compression should be done on the hard surface. The surface must be flat and must be hard to achieve adequate recoil. So when we start the chest compressions, the next thing is that we go to the airway. For some of us here who watch football, I think there was a particular footballer who suffered the cardiac arrest, I think it was months back. And the captain of the team was appreciated for something he did. What he did was that he tried to make the airway of that player patent. And what he did was a simple procedure, which we all learned today. It's called a head tilt and a chin lift. Very easy, straightforward. I will demonstrate it after the video. That alone helps to displace the tongue on the posterior pharynx and ensure that the airway is very, very patent. So after then, we can now do 2 best 2 best. The 2020 guidelines states that you push hard and fast. That when you are pushing the chest should also rise back. That is what we mean by adequate chest makeup. And we avoid what we call over-ventilation. We are only going to give 2 breaths and nothing more. Giving too much ventilation to the patient will increase the intragastric pressure, which will inevitably lead to reduction in endoscopy count, reduce cardiac output, and further hypertension, which will be a serious complication. So we do that. Then, afterwards, we can now get the defibrillator, which is this. The defibrillator follows the voice prompt and a visual prompt, which guides the giver, whether the lay respirator or the medical personnel, how to give shocks to the patient. So that is what the AED does. And since I said earlier that 60% of cardiac arrest videos have ventricular fibrillation, so what that means that they are amenable to defibrillation and shocks. So prompt defibrillation and early CPR is imperative and important for the survival of the patient. Finally, I would want to say that while everything in life can wait, cardiopulmonary resuscitation cannot wait. The moment a patient or anyone has been noticed to have suffered the cardiac arrest, immediate chest compression, rapid defibrillation of the patient will ensure increased chances of survival for such patient. Thank you very much.
"24 hours a day, 7 days a week."
This is
Star News TV.
The glory of the latter house.